We've got a call down to the Beenleigh Station. There's supposed to be a person unconscious there. I have Dreamworld responding, but if you'd pop down, and I've also got the police checking out that it's not a hoax.
A series of anonymous emergency calls was just the beginning.
There was blood everywhere. Not just on that side of the car, on that side of the car, on the boot of the car.
In this murder case, police would be faced with a wall of silence and a climate of fear.
There was someone right in front of me saying, "You've seen too much, you've seen too much."
That would test their patience and skills.
You must have a bad memory about what happens tonight.
There were major players outside of those in what has been described as a killing vehicle. At the end of the day, they've got to make a decision what side they want to be on.
To be able to take that further, we needed hard evidence.
I commented to the partner I was with that I think the bloke's going to bring out the murderer.
He goes, "Turn around." So I've turned around. He said, "Get on your knees." All right, I've got on my knees.
When the battered body of a man was found dumped here at this ambulance station, police had no idea who he was. The investigation into his brutal murder would cause a judge to comment that the case read like a B-grade movie script. But the violence was real and the ending truly tragic.
Police attended the Beenleigh Ambulance Station as a result of a number of 000 phone calls that had been made to the ambulance. The Beenleigh ambulance was out on another job, and Beenleigh police then sent a patrol car around to the ambulance station.
Ambulance centre's right speaking. Mate, Mark from Beenleigh Police Station, outside Beenleigh Ambo. Mate, we need an ambulance here ASAP. This fella's got tremendous head injuries. Mate, he's either deceased or very near to.
When I arrived down there, the scene had been taped off, cordoned off by the uniform officers and attendants, and down near the main entrance to the ambulance station was the body of an obviously deceased male person, heavily tattooed and covered in blood with some very obvious visible injuries. I've investigated assaults and some serious assaults previously, but the injuries were astounding. Probably some of the most extensive and the most horrific that I had witnessed myself up to that time. There was a tram track bruising, which are parallel or tapered lines coinciding with each other, which indicates a baseball bat or a pipe. The person had obviously undergone a serious beating of some sort. Where that had occurred was obviously not at the ambulance station.
In most circumstances, bodies are found where they're assaulted. In this particular case, it's been dumped, so it automatically presumes a car, so therefore tyre impression evidence becomes important.
Essentially, we're looking for evidence that would have been brought to that scene and which didn't normally belong at that scene, which might help us to paint a picture of what had occurred.
As they know well in forensic circles, every contact leaves a trace. And that was what the crime scene examiners were hoping was the case here.
The body himself was covered in blood, which represents a bit of a challenge because there may be evidence in the blood on the body. I performed a tape lifting technique on the upper surface of the body and on the back of the body to see whether or not there was any fibres or hairs there that may have been associated with an offender.
But finding that offender was dependent on identifying the victim first. And with no wallet in sight, police took his fingerprints in hope that they might be on file.
First thing we needed to do was to establish who this person was, and then after that, establish the movements that we could track prior to him arriving at the ambulance station.
What police did know at this stage was that a series of emergency calls had brought them to this location.
What we think is happening is these people, they've made 3 phone calls now and they're moving from phone box to phone box, and we think that maybe they've assaulted them, dumped them there and gone.
Is there any chance you could start some traces on those 3 calls to find out which phone boxes they're using?
Yeah, we know which phone boxes they're using.
3 of those phone calls All were within a couple of kilometre radius of the ambulance station.
Bloke beat up real bad. I just got him from the pub. Get someone there now. I can't get a pulse or any bloody thing on him, so you be quick.
What's your phone number?
Hurry up.
What's your phone number?
Someone beaten up outside the Beenleigh Ambulance. Yeah, outside the Beenleigh Ambulance Station. Yeah, he's not looking good. We've got to get someone there quick. Look, he's not looking good, right? Ambulance emergency only. Yeah, listen, mate, there's a badly injured bloke lying outside the bloody Beenleigh Ambulance Centre, mate, on the ground.
There were certainly a number of voices on those tapes. Also, the urgency of the message increased over the particular calls.
Well, he's not breathing, so can you hurry up and fucking get someone out here?
It was difficult to tell whether or not those people were witnesses or possible offenders, but certainly the lack of giving identifying details and a number of other factors made it pretty clear to us that the people who had made those phone calls had some intimate knowledge of how that body came to be at the ambulance station.
Yeah, the ambulance is there, yeah? All right. Where are you? I'll find out the condition of this bloke. Where are you ringing from, matey? Hey?
That last call came in nearly an hour after the first, and it was made 25 kilometres away. The crime scene team needed to move quickly.
The telephone boxes were all fingerprinted in terms of the doors, the handsets, all the glass in the booths. We found various tyre impressions, shoe impressions. There were numerous cigarette butts, any one of which could have contained the DNA belonging to an offender.
As potential evidence continued to be collected at the crime scene, the fingerprint taken from the dead man had found a match.
Within about an hour and a half, we had an identification from the Fingerprint Bureau advising me of the name of the deceased. His name was Darryl Lewis.
Darryl Lewis was a petty criminal, but this 34-year-old's criminal history was non-violent, unlike his death.
What was difficult for us to know at that early point in time was what Darryl may have done, which could have possibly led to him having been bashed to death.
Ambulance officers were out on another job when the victim was dumped right at the front door of their station.
The victim had been identified as Darryl Lewis, whose last known address was a semi-rural property just a few kilometres from where his body had been dumped.
Knocked on the front door. A male person came to the front door and spoke to us. I asked him, did you know where Darryl Lewis was right now? And he was quite vague in answering, and no, not really, I don't know where he is. And I advised him then that we had some bad news and that, in fact, Darryl Lewis had been discovered he was deceased. And the oddest reply that came back was, oh, okay. And it was clear at that stage to me that the person I was speaking to at that stage had some knowledge that something had happened to Darryl Lewis. He then said, wait here a minute, I'll go and get somebody you should talk to. I thought to myself, and I think I commented to the partner I was with, that I think the bloke's going to bring out the murderer. In fact, when the door opened again, it was another male person with the first one, and that male person had obviously also been assaulted. That person was Scott Lewis, who was the brother of the deceased Darryl Lewis, and he was obviously not very well. We went inside the house. I wouldn't have gotten past the first question when he was visibly about to be ill. So I then just told him just to relax and I'll get an ambulance. We contacted the ambulance and they attended the house and took Scott away. I really didn't know what we'd walked into at that stage because we have one deceased at the ambulance station. We have someone who's obviously been seriously assaulted. We now have two different scenes that we have to investigate. And then we've got the third male person, Paul Schultz, who obviously has some knowledge but has been quite evasive in what he can or intends to tell us about what happened. So yeah, we realised at that stage we had a fairly big job in front of us.
The place was in disarray, bits of broken furniture in there as well, blood staining extending from one end to the other. But I did find a latent shoe sole impression on the lid of the chest freezer, and just directly above the freezer was a manhole access point into the ceiling cavity. I then looked into the ceiling cavity and saw there were other shoe sole impressions similar to that one up in the dust, which then enabled a firm deduction to be reached that someone had been up in the ceiling.
It was clear the intruders had ransacked the place. But why? Paul Schultz wasn't giving police any clues. But outside, a car covered in blood quickly caught their attention.
Outside in the backyard was a white Holden Commodore. Looking inside that car, it was clear that there was a lot of blood in the back seat area of the vehicle.
There was blood everywhere. Not just on that side of the car, on that side of the car, on the boot of the car.
People who aren't experienced in this area are fairly well overwhelmed by the patterns because it looks like a mess. There certainly was what we class as impact spatter, which is a form of projected blood. There was contact smears, which are those that would be formed from a blood-covered object just coming into contact with something. There were some cast-off patterns there too, which typically come from a weapon of some description, like a baseball bat swinging around.
What we were able to glean from that was that certainly a very violent assault or assaults had occurred in close proximity to the white Commodore.
That white car was owned by the victim, and its blood-soaked interior was cause for question. As it was taken away for testing, the team searched for other clues as to who had been there that night.
There was lots of bloodied objects, shoe sole impressions, tyre prints, and signs of struggle in the backyard. As I worked my way down the veranda, there was a cigarette butt. There was no other cigarette butts in the area. There was just one on the veranda, so in the context of my examination, I thought this was significant.
A latex glove that was located on the side of the driveway at Lance Road was also seized as an exhibit.
The deceased man's brother had also been attacked. He was found at their Greenbank home this morning. Detectives sealed off Lance Road while they removed evidence and interviewed neighbours.
And about 170 metres north of the property, we found a stain on the side of the roadway which looked to us to be blood. There was a house directly opposite where the stain was located, so we were particularly keen to speak to people in that house.
And he's asked, had we heard anything during the night? And all I'd heard cars going down the road.
They told us of seeing a vehicle or vehicles stopping in the vicinity of where we discovered the stain the previous evening.
They went out the gate, turned left, and a short way down, the first car kept going, and the second car pulled over to the side. The brake lights came on. That's the only reason I could see that it had stopped, because when he put his foot on the brakes, the light shined up through the trees.
One of those two cars was definitely Darryl Lewis's. Police had just received vital footage.
We seized a security video from the mobile service station at Beenleigh that depicts the victim's vehicle driving through the service station area and then a short time later driving back out of the service station area. The service station is right next to the ambulance station where the deceased was dumped.
But who was driving that car was unknown. The only two witnesses who might be able to tell weren't talking.
Scott Lewis was still in hospital and had been quite seriously injured. Paul Schultz was afraid to be speaking with police following his ordeal.
There were fears. He had fears about what had happened, and that indicated to us that the people who were responsible for this knew where to find him and had made threats to him.
Darryl Lewis was found dead outside an ambulance station. His home had been ransacked, his brother seriously injured, and his flatmate was scared to talk.
If you put yourself in the position of Scott Lewis and Paul Schultz, you've just witnessed a very serious assault that led to the death of, in Scott's case, his brother, and in Paul's case, one of his friends. If you're going to be released by these people who have just killed your friend, and it needs the assurance that you maintain your silence, I don't think that's a very difficult decision for them to make.
But we reinforced to them that they were better off being on the side of the police and working towards the good of what being a member of the public is, rather than have members of a gang chase them for the rest of their lives.
Well, I'd like you now just to take through us basically what happened on that night.
Paul Schultz decided that he would take the side of the police.
Okay, well, it starts in the house.
As part of the investigation, I conducted a video reenactment with witness Paul Schultz at the crime scene at Lance Road.
I was in my room, which is up here.
It assisted us as investigators greatly in getting our minds around exactly what transpired at that particular house out there on the night of the offence.
I've been getting myself ready to get into bed. I've, for some reason, had some sort of idea that there was someone outside the property. I've walked out. I've seen lights. I've got to here. I've seen the headlights. I thought it was Darryl's car, similar headlights. I've stood here for a few minutes, nothing happening. I thought, well, this is something that's not usual. I've opened the door. I've stuck my head out. Someone from behind the headlights said, I hear someone, he might be able to help us. They've asked, is Darryl here? I said, no, he's not. They've said, is Scott here? I said, he's not here either. But I've seen someone in the bushes, and they were like this. There was a firearm on them. I've been asked, they said, who are you? I said, I'm Paul. And they said, rightio, Paul, we're not here to hurt you. If you're smart enough and you play the game, you'll get out, you'll get through the night unharmed.
They forced their way into the house and had Paul Schultz sit down and keep his eyes down and instructed Paul not to look at them.
So I'm sitting down, I'm looking at the TV, and people are filing into the house. There's people all over the show. There's people there, there's people in my room, you know. Again, there's people here. People are going through the ceiling.
And it was quite apparent that the perpetrators had gone to some length to try and find whatever it was they were looking for.
The person warns me of the situation that is going on involving the people that I am sharing the place with. Tells me that they're in a bit of shit and there's a few people that want to come round and have a bit of a go at them. And it'd be to my best interest to get myself out of here, because the next people will probably just come through and pop everyone. They were worse to that effect. I kept my eyes on the TV as I was told, and it was some time until the car entered the property. Everyone in the house vacated through that door, and the bloke who was standing behind me, he moved himself to that door and he stood facing to the outside. As I was sitting there, I could hear quite a major beating going on in the backyard. It went for a while. It got pretty loud. A person came through the door, said, right, we're going. He's coming with us. He pointed at me. I've been marched out to about here. I seen motion, and I seen Darryl's legs go out. He dropped down like that. And within an instant, there was someone right in front of me who had their shirt like this with a baseball bat in my face, saying, you've seen too much, you've seen too much. All right? I'm standing here like this. I've said, I haven't seen anything. I've seen nothing. He goes, turn around. So I've turned around. He said, get on your knees. All right? I've got on my knees. I've done this. And then I didn't hear anything more of him. I was here for about 5 minutes, I suppose. Not even that, I don't know, a matter of minutes. I was picked up from my knees. The car was kind of where it is, but it's kind of more straight on. They've opened the door and they've put me in and they've told me to sit there with me, like looking at the deck. Darryl was bundled in the best they could, ended up in the back. His head's behind the driver's seat where my feet are. I've slipped my feet out of there. In the process, my thongs have stayed there.
In the second vehicle was Scott Lewis, and the vehicles then left the property. And Paul tells us that Darryl Lewis was continuing to fight even though he was being held down on the floor of the back of the white Commodore. And a short distance down the road where we discovered the blood stain on the side of the road, the vehicle was stopped and he was taken out to ensure that he would settle down.
Schultz, whilst he was in the car, was instructed by those persons to keep his head down and not to look at anything, basically. Don't look at their faces, don't look at what's going on, obviously to limit his knowledge of any further evidence that he may give at a later stage.
Once Darryl had been put back in the vehicle, Paul Schultz tells us that he then was much more subdued.
His physical condition deteriorated quite rapidly. His breathing became shallower to the point where he had stopped breathing.
Paul made it known to the driver of the vehicle and the other occupants that Darryl wasn't in a very good condition. Paul Schultz was then driven to a number of locations that he was not aware of.
He was then reunited with Scott Lewis.
They were given a beer. They were told in no uncertain terms that there would be consequences if they were to speak with police or anyone else about what had occurred that night. Scott and Paul Schultz were then allowed to go home in the white Holden.
So detectives knew what happened that night, but still didn't know who was involved. That piece of the puzzle was about to be solved by forensics. A gang of men had raided the property where Paul Schultz lived. They were looking for something and were prepared to go to any lengths to get it, even murder.
The information from Paul Schultz was that the offenders, when they arrived, were armed with an array of weapons, including shotguns, pistols, baseball bats. And Schultz also mentioned that they were wearing disposable gloves.
When police had searched the property, they had found a glove on the driveway.
Upon fingerprint examination, our experts were able to obtain a latent fingerprint on the inside of that glove.
The glove had been dusted with powder, photographed, and certain ridges traced. This information was then fed into the computer, and in this case, there was one perfect match.
We were able to identify Stephen Avis, who we knew to be the Sergeant-at-Arms of the Finks Motorcycle Club. The Sergeant-at-Arms was generally responsible for order and discipline within the club.
And so we had his fingerprint that was recovered from the inside of a rubber glove. Further to that, his DNA profile was also located on a cigarette butt at the front door of the crime scene. So that led us to believe that he had involvement and complicity in the murder of Darryl Lewis.
And so we knew that a significant assault had occurred by members of an outlaw motorcycle gang.
But for now, police decided not to arrest Avis. He was one of a number of gang members there that night.
We wanted to maintain the secrecy and the integrity of our investigation. We didn't want to show our hand early, and we wanted to be prepared with the course of action that we wished to take against these people. And as we knew, there was a lot more people involved than Steve Avis.
However, there was one other suspect.
When we were able to convince Paul that, that he would be safe and he didn't have to feel threatened in this particular situation, he prepared a comfit for us. Comfit uses a computer-generated image of the facial features of a person of interest.
But his name and the motive for the murder remained a mystery.
Scott Lewis, the man that could hold all the leads to solving the case, remains in hospital, dangerously ill and still unable to talk. Detectives were hoping the 33-year-old could identify his brother Darryl's killers.
I'm giving no resistance to anyone here. Like, guys tell me what you want me to do and I'll just do it.
One of the approaches that I adopted was to have Paul convince Scott that the best way forward was to give the police as much information as they possibly could to allow us to do our job. And largely as a result of Paul Schultz helping us in that regard, Scott Lewis then opened up completely.
I closed the gates and jumped back in the car, and myself and Darryl drove up the driveway.
Not long after Scott Lewis left hospital, he ignored the repercussions of the offenders and told police his version of what happened the night his brother was murdered.
We stopped the car and approximately about here. I opened this door here, got out, and saw a man standing there. I reached down, picked up a bar or something that was lying here, and I said, "Who the hell are you and what do you want?" And he said, "Drop it or I'll shoot." I thought about it for a minute, then dropped it. Another man came up from this side here, and I turned. He says, "I've got one on you." He said, "Don't move." He held some storage shed keys up towards me and he dangled them that and he said, "You've got my bike." I said, "Which bike?" And he said, "My bike." He punched me in the face. After that, I was hit with something and I was lying on the ground about here, about here.
Scott was hit across the knee with a bat, fractured his knee. He was hit to the head and other areas of his body and was quite seriously injured.
As I tried to get up, my knee kept sliding down my leg. He said to me, "Stay where you are, it's fucking broken."
What could you see then? Do you know where these people were?
Approximately where over that bloke, where that bloke was there was where Darryl was assaulted. I'd say there was, facing this way, 5 or 6 blokes around him, hitting him, and he was throwing his hands back, saying, "No, no, no," trying to protect himself at the time.
During that assault, Scott's brother, Darryl, received quite extensive injuries. So Scott then decided that giving the information to the Finks was the best option.
They wanted to be taken to our storage shed. Darryl was sort of bent down a bit more, going like that. He had his hand here and was putting his leg in the boot of the car. I said to them, "Not in the fucking boot." And I put my hand up here and slammed the boot.
As we know, Darryl was thrown into the car with Paul Schultz. In that same car were 3 Finks members. Scott followed in another car, but neither vehicle made it to the storage shed.
All thoughts of recovering the bike there and then that night, I think, were shelved, and it became an issue of self-preservation on the part of all the people who had been involved.
Investigators were now sure they had the motive for the murder of Darryl Lewis, but they needed to find out whose bike it was and where it was hidden. Scott Lewis finally revealed the address, a storage shed half an hour's drive from their property.
Once we had that information, we took out a search warrant at the storage shed and we seized the motorcycle parts that were contained in that shed. Those parts were absolutely critical to the investigation because those parts were actually the motive for why this whole incident had occurred. We then, through further inquiries, managed to find a person who had been a mechanic who had worked on that motorcycle. And when that person looked at the parts at the police station, He was able, from certain marks and identifying particulars, to conclusively say that they were the parts on the motorcycle that he'd worked on, which had belonged to the de facto president of the Finks, Stephen Cranny. Stephen Cranny certainly had enough influence to be able to have up to 18 members of his club come with him to recover his stolen motorbike.
Detectives had 2 suspects and 1 unidentified Finks member. It was now time to turn up the heat.
They needed to consider whether they were prepared to stay staunch and not talk, or whether they were going to look after their own interests and benefit themselves.
A discarded glove, a cigarette butt, and some stolen Harley-Davidson bike parts had led police to 2 suspects in the murder of Darryl Lewis. But Stephen Cranny and his sergeant of arms were not the only ones there the night Darryl Lewis died.
Once we know we're looking at the Finks Outlaw Motorcycle Club, then obviously there's a lot of police intelligence available to us in terms of who the members are and who their associates are and where they live and what their occupations are, their motor vehicles, those types of issues.
In a short time, police had a list of names.
The issue for us then was to determine who of these members had been involved. We had 2 witnesses, Scott Lewis and Paul Schultz, who we assumed would have been able to identify people who had been involved, at least some of the people who had been involved.
We always believed that the suspects for this matter would not cooperate at all with police. The possibility of them participating in a physical lineup was always very remote. So the next best avenue is to create one ourselves.
Through various sources, police obtained footage of the Finks and other outlaw motorcycle clubs and their members at a hotel.
And Paul Schultz and Scott Lewis were able to identify certain members.
They included the 2 known suspects, Stephen Cranny and Steve Avis.
And so it was time for us to pull in the people that we knew we could prove had been involved in that murder.
A sledgehammer, their only calling card, 50 cars roared out of Logan Police Headquarters, all bound for dawn raids, all waiting for the radio call to pounce.
Go.
We believe that a stolen Harley-Davidson motorcycle is the motive for the murder, and we believe that that's what culminated in his death.
The bike was owned by the Finks motorcycle gang. Police believe the kill a revenge attack. Today their clubhouse was scoured. 1 gang member arrested and charged with murder, 41-year-old Jeffrey Lloyd Nelson from Southport. Police charging and questioning dozens.
It was a large-scale operation. Numerous houses of Finks members and associates were subject of search warrants. There was firearms seized, there was weaponry along the lines of bats, sticks, similar type items that were seized as a result of the execution of those warrants.
So as a result of those initial round of raids, 4 people were arrested: Stephen Cranny, Jeff Nelson, Mark Gibson and Steve Avis.
The arrest of these 4 for murder and other offences was just the beginning.
It was important for us, once we'd locked up the original 4, to make sure that we had a solid plan for how we might gather further evidence and strengthen the brief against them and identify and charge other people who might have been involved.
Yeah, we've got Cranny at Carrara. There's 2 there.
The next step was to check all mobile telephone records of those in custody with other Finks members on that night.
We were perusing their phone activity and identifying who they were contacting.
They rang as well?
There was obviously a large amount of telephone activity between the persons that we knew were involved and suspected of being involved immediately before, during and after the incident.
And through an electronic process, we were able to track the movements of those telephones, which then gave us a particular area that they were operating from.
Certain members of the Finks had moved as a group from an area that included the Lewis property to the ambulance station and then back to their clubhouse, some 25 kilometres away. Not far from which was the phone box where the last emergency call was placed.
Telephone records became critical. They showed the associations between relevant mobile phones, particularly owned by relevant people at relevant times.
So police now had a further list of suspects, but as yet they didn't know exactly what role each of them played, particularly who was in the car when Darryl was bashed for the last time. And getting any of the gang members to talk was impossible.
By virtue of their philosophies, they don't wish to cooperate with authorities, they don't provide statements or do interviews with authorities. What we really ultimately needed to achieve was to infiltrate the cone of silence that we were being encountered with and to obtain the cooperation of one of the people that were actually a participant in the events that night.
We were able to put the most pressure on those that were sitting in custody because they knew that they were facing murder charges. So the offer was there that if someone was to come forward and to give us the real story of what had occurred that night, then that would be a matter that could be taken into consideration in relation to the sentencing of that particular offender, depending on their role in the matter. They needed to consider whether they were prepared to stay staunch and not talk, or whether they were going to look after their own interests and benefit themselves. And so we consciously made the solicitors aware, certainly by producing evidence, certainly the telephone evidence, that there was a substantial body of evidence there implicating them, and that the chance of conviction was probably reasonably good.
So good that 5 months after Darryl Lewis died, the 4 members of the Finks were committed to trial for his murder.
And so, by applying that pressure, we arrived at a situation where one of those members sitting in jail, through their solicitor, indicated to us that they wanted to tell us what had occurred that night. And that person was Stephen Cranny.
I'm going, what the hell's going on here? Everything's gone to, turned from bloody champagne to shit just like that.
It was now 18 months since Darryl Lewis was murdered. And during that entire time, the outlaw code of silence remained strong. But now the de facto president, whose stolen bike had been the catalyst for the actions on that night, was about to live up to the name of the club and become a true Fink.
A bloke that I know casually, I don't even know real well, told me that if I wanted to find my bike, these Lewises had it. We're still in a shed at Springwood somewhere. We figured, well, first of all, we've got to get us the keys to the shed. It's obviously in a lock-up shed. We have to get the keys to the shed. That was the plan. At no stage, anyone was supposed to have been bloody hurt or killed or anything like that. Scott Lewis, I punched him in the mouth because he sort of threatened me with the iron bar. Glenn Laycock came over, hit him in the head with a baseball bat, hit him in the leg first, which dropped him to his knees, and then clubbed him with a baseball bat. Lewis has tried to get up off the ground. I've told Lewis, look, sit on the ground, because I could see his fucking leg, like he hit him in the kneecap, mate. You could see the fucking kneecap just fucking swallowed up.
He said to me, stay where you are, it's fucking broken.
You'll be right, just sit there. And then Laycock went over. He was the one that threatened Schultz.
He had this shirt like this with a baseball bat in my face, saying, you've seen too much, you've seen too much.
And then he went over and started whacking Darryl Lewis around the legs with the bat. Then Ava said, well, let's get out of here, there's been too much fucking noise sort of thing. I said, you're right, let's go to the shed and get my fucking bike.
Have you had any conversation with Steve Avis regarding the fact that he's left a glove there with his fingerprint?
I said, how the fucking hell did you leave your glove there? He said he left it on the roof of the car and it must have fallen off.
As for the cigarette butt that contained his DNA...
No, he reckons he's planted it, all that sort of shit in the garbage,
Is that what he said?
Yeah, Everyone got into their cars. Lou Stokes got in the driver's seat of the car. Glenn Laycock got into the passenger seat of the car. Jeff got in the back, and there was Lewis and Schultz in the Commodore.
How was Darryl Lewis physically when he was put in the back of that car?
He was still fighting and kicking. There we go. And I noticed the Commodore wasn't behind us. I took just about to turn around when they came around the corner. They came up beside me and they said, oh, Jesus, you know, they told me, they said, oh, we think he's dead. And I've gone, you know, I shit myself. I said, what do you mean he's fucking dead? You know, what's happened? Because when he left here, there was, you know, there was bugger all wrong with him. From there to where they're telling me he's fucking dead. And I'm, you know, I've just fucking hit the panic buttons. I said, well, get into the fucking ambulance at Beenleigh.
Certainly there was a degree of panic began to set in, and that there were a number of phone calls were made from different members of the club starting to talk to each other that they had a situation developing. And that was that they had a seriously injured person in the back of a vehicle they'd stolen, and they had to do something in order to get this person some sort of medical attention, or he was going to die.
The next thing I knew, they were back at my place. They'd come back and said the ambulance station was closed. They'd thrown him in the front yard, rung the fucking bell, and rang AAA. I then got in my car, gone back up past the Beenleigh Ambulance Station. There's no one there. The place is in darkness. I've then rung AAA myself.
Ambulance emergency only. Yeah, listen, mate, there's a badly injured bloke lying outside the bloody Beenleigh Ambulance Centre, mate, on the ground.
Well, that's that call you've got at me on the ambulance. That's when I rang them. I've then gone back to my place. I'm going, what the hell's going on here? Everything's gone to, you know, turned from bloody champagne to shit, just like that. I did not know he'd been dragged out of the car.
No.
When I left the house, he was fucking hurt.
When did you first find out he'd been dragged out of that car?
When we got back to my house and Jeff told me.
Okay.
What I was told at the time was that Laycock had dragged him out and took to him with the bat.
Do you recall what his words were?
Just bashed him with the bat.
Okay. And did Laycock say anything in response to this?
Not really.
Stephen Cranny told police Glenn Laycock had struck the fatal blows, but he hadn't been in the car when it happened. So police desperately needed a bikie to come forward and give evidence.
We still needed a further witness who was actually present when the fatal blows were delivered on Lewis at the side of the road.
The raids began early this morning. Warrants were executed on 22 properties from Warrangarry in the south to Eagleby in the north, police seeking members of the Finks motorcycle gang. One by one, arrests were made. Charges varied from murder to kidnapping and drug offences.
Among those eventually arrested and charged, Glenn Laycock, who had allegedly bashed Darryl with the bat, and Lou Stokes, the driver of Darryl's car, who bore a striking similarity to the Comfit.
Yeah, that looks like Lou Stokes.
Jeff Nelson, the third occupant of the car, was already in jail awaiting his trial for the murder of Darryl Lewis.
Why did you actually decide to come forward to the police to make this statement today?
Why? Because I sat in jail for 2 years for something I didn't do. And it was an accident. Like, bloke got out of control and the other bloke saved my life, and I just couldn't stand up and give him up.
That other bloke was Glenn Laycock.
So after being in there 2 years, I said to him,
The two Finks members had been mates for 13 years.
Just take your time.
I said to him about getting up and telling the truth, but he was sort of too scared to.
We, as an investigative team, were very excited by the prospect of Nelson cooperating with the authorities.
Waited and waited.
He could provide direct evidence and direct testimony as to what he witnessed on the side of the road of the actions of Laycock in the killing of Lewis.
But you over on, and Darryl just went berserk again, just went crazy.
Shut him the fuck up!
Car stopped. Trying to hit the handle, and I've come out the car. He's on top of me. And then Glenn's come out and dragged him off me, and then Glenn's given him a couple of thumps on the head with a baseball bat.
And we believe that it was these injuries that ultimately resulted in Darryl's death.
What are your feelings towards Glenn Laycock?
Just pissed off that he never said anything earlier.
Okay.
Jeffrey Nelson was today jailed for 9 years after pleading guilty to manslaughter and deprivation of liberty.
I'll just give you a minute.
The Supreme Court heard Nelson was involved in struggles with Darryl, but was not the bikie who repeatedly and viciously beat the 34-year-old unconscious.
Do you want to have a drink of water or something?
No, I'm right.
Jeff Nelson had also turned Crown witness because his health was failing.
Because Laycock hadn't said anything.
After serving a minimum sentence of 2.5 years, he was released. He died soon after.
In the end, Laycock was convicted of murder. Lou Stokes, the driver of the car, he was convicted of manslaughter.
Stephen Cranny's murder charge was dropped. He and 5 other Finks members were convicted of various offences ranging from grievous bodily harm, deprivation of liberty and entering a dwelling with intent. All 6 are currently out of jail.
I think it was a very good result.
Thanks forever!
As a team of investigators, it's always good for us to be able to have the evidence forensically obtained, matching closely with the evidence obtained from human sources throughout the investigation, matching with information and intelligence that might have been analysed and used in the investigation.
It's difficult to get convictions against outlaw motorcycle gangs because of the fear factor. So for us to get such a good result and secure some lengthy convictions was a substantial result for law enforcement agencies.
If you know, but that's been for fucking Laycock, none of this bullshit would have happened, you know.
On looking back at this particular case, it's hard not to note some concern that people are prepared to take another human life for the sake of a motorcycle. I don't think the person's background, the type of person that was the victim in this particular case, bears any relevance. The fact remains that a group of individuals here were prepared to take another human life for the sake of recovering a stolen motorcycle.